we'll get going. I'm just waiting for people to come in. 20, 30, 40, 50,
Oh, is that all?
60. They're all logging on through the computer. 100, 120, 140.
I'm sorry for giving you fright that I wasn't turning up.
Right, the spotlight will be on you with the questions.
It's terrible. I'm going to leave it off. Sorry.
Yeah, that is gracious too.
Okay, everybody's just loading into the room. We've got 300 attendees so far.
Wow.
Going up.
Well, we're not going to talk to less than 1,000, are we?
Okay, right. Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this this webinar. It's a discussion webinar. My name's Carl Collier. I'll introduce the other people just in a second. There isn't really a need to ask questions tonight. We've had a few questions asked during each of the webinars, and we saved a few to the end. Roger, can you turn your braces down, please? Right. Yeah. And we've also recently asked for some questions, and we were somewhat engulfed. So we've got a fair sort of spattering of them, and hopefully it will bring it together with everybody. We've had 8 webinars on the National Bee Improvement Programme. Joe Widdicombe, a bee farmer, did the first 2 on the National Bee Improvement Programme. First of all, the outline, and then more details on the participation. Then Norman Carrick, MDB, talked about global pandemics and bee imports, native bees. Really interesting chat, that one. Peter Jenkins from Wales gave a really interesting chat about 50 years experience of importing bees affecting his local stock. And then Grace McCormack, who I'm not going to call Professor Grace McCormack, but it's just Grace, so that'll be nice and clear. Talked about resilient honeybees and varroa and everything. And then we had Roger for 3 sessions. Roger's had well over half a century, like more than one of the other panelists as well, of beekeeping, and seen thousands of people's hives. Together, this crew has over 200 years of beekeeping experience, and they've shared their sort of interests and skills and knowledge beforehand. What we'll do is fire on with some questions, if that's okay. I'll ask a question and probably aim it at one person initially, and then others can chip in afterwards. Okay, so we'll start off with the first question. This one will be to Roger. We'll pick on Roger first. Those braces are very bright, Roger. Okay. In the last session that you did, you mentioned that you should ensure that the colony has been queenless for 3 or 4 hours before introducing a new queen cell. The person asking the question thinks that's a surprisingly short time. Can you elaborate, please?
Yes, this was probably one of my usual throwaway remarks. It's not a wind-up, is it? Who's the question? It wasn't Jenkins or McCormick or
somebody called Ian,
Carrick or okay, right.
Naming names,
it sounds genuine then. I obviously don't know the questioner, but there's a lot in beekeeping that's come out of books rather than necessarily from experience. And the further you get into beekeeping, the more you realise what you can get away with. But let's just have a look at this one. Bees in general won't accept a queen cell if they think they've got a queen. Now, I say in general because sometimes they do. And if you're in any doubt, what you can do, of course, is protect the queen cell. Now, when you handle as many colonies in the same apiary as I do, you realise that certain things are different than what it says in the books. And I hit upon this because I dequeened a colony in the morning, and in the afternoon, I had some queen cells. I thought, well, I'll just put them in the hive and see what happens. Went back next time, and the queen cell had emerged. And I think it's one of those things that you've got to be careful when you're talking to beginners about it. And it's a fault that probably us more experienced beekeepers make, that you know what you can get away with and when. Now, sometimes perhaps you get a let's say a nectar flow, everything's going on. You can do anything almost with a colony of bees. But if perhaps there's a nectar dearth, they're sometimes very much more difficult, and you can't get away with the same tricks. But in general, the smaller the colony, the quicker it realizes it is queenless. And with a mini nuke, for instance, you can take a queen out and you can immediately put a queen cell in. But if you did that with a full colony, you probably wouldn't get away with it. With a nuke, 2, 3, 4 frames, it might take perhaps an hour for them to realize that they're queenless. A full colony, perhaps a couple of hours or so. And then very often you can find you can put a queen cell in there and it will be accepted. I can't quite remember the context, but I suspect it was something of that nature, probably as a question, I would think. So yes, you can get away with it. Now, the great thing about it is, being an ordinary beekeeper, you can try little experiments like this, providing you take into account that what might happen this time may not happen next time, and it's probably conditions, weather conditions, or the size of the colony that makes a difference.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. Anyone else got any contradictory views on that? No, it sounds sensible. Okay, thank you. Peter, on you next, if you don't mind. Gary asked a question. Could you say something about the best way, in your opinion, to overwinter a nuke? When to do it, what to feed them, and when to feed, and when to move it to a full-size box, whether or not to insulate, and whether you should have an open mesh floor or be replaced by a solid one. Now, you come from the Welsh mountains and valleys, so you've probably got some good experience of this.
Okay, well, so we'll start off with the open mesh floors. Like everybody else, I went into open mesh floors and probably had about half my colonies at one point in open mesh floors, but I've gone completely off them now. I find that the bees don't overwinter so well on them, quite harsh conditions. They overwinter better on a solid floor. And the bees don't really like open mesh floors. And the reason I say this, I've only ever once seen a swarm go into a box with an open mesh floor. So perhaps they think they can't defend it or something. So open mesh floors are a no-no. When or not to insulate. I try and overwinter my nukes in wooden boxes. I've got some polystyrene boxes, but what I find with the polystyrene boxes that in the spring they damp and they have slugs in them.
Yeah.
Don't know if anybody else has found this.
Yep.
But so solid wooden box, solid floor. Make sure they're big enough, but the native bees will overwinter better. Will overwinter better than yellow bees with a smaller nuke, and you'll still survive and still be there in the spring. So I think that's answered that question. When to move into a full-size box? Well, this year I got all my nukes except 2 in full-size boxes. Full-size boxes, few frames in the middle, and a blank frame. What do you call it? A blank frame.
Yeah. When did you do that, Peter?
The wooden frame, either side, right? So there's not a full complement of frames in there, and they're in the middle, and there's a carpet over the top. So there we are. That's all I'm going to say.
Brilliant. When did you transfer them from nukes to brood boxes, Peter?
July.
July, right? Okay. Yeah, I did one today because it's a last chance. It was rammed, so I took a chance. Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's a bit late for me.
Yeah, and me really, but yeah, they were still consume or wanted to consume, but there was nowhere to go. And anything different? Oh, Roger has, yeah.
Yeah, I think I overwinter quite a lot of nukes because, as much as anything, I want to try and keep queens for spring. And I think one of the mistakes people make is putting them into winter too weak in bees. They need to be strong in bees. So certainly the frames are brood on. If in perhaps October you've got frames where you can't see the brood, or if the queen's gone off low, you can't see the comb underneath, then you'll probably be okay. But I do see people splitting, certainly beginners, splitting colonies in sort of August or so, and they just haven't got the chance to get enough young bees into the colony, and that's what you need, young bees.
Yeah. Okay, so get enough bees, make sure your brood's covered, get them fed. Peter's experience is solid wooden floor, and they seem to be refraining from the mesh. But again, we've all got different experiences on this, so thank you very much. Next question, we'll ping this one at Joe, if you don't mind. Colin asks, when requeening a hive, how long should you wait before you decide it's not worked? And what should you do? So maybe the queen's not mated, or she's certainly not laying. And what sort of action is it? Adding another frame of eggs, or uniting from another colony, or something else?
Of course, there are a lot of different circumstances, really, and I don't know which one we're referring to. But if, for example, you have a colony that's rearing queen cells, and perhaps part of your swarm prevention may be removing the old queen and letting them requeen with one of their queen cells, I think, and we visit our bees once a week. So, and if you come after 3 weeks, you might be lucky, a new queen might have hatched to be laying, but I like to leave them 4 weeks, really, from queen cell to, a ripe queen cell, should we say, to a new laying queen. I think you've got to allow 4 weeks. Normally, after that, if it hasn't happened, it's not successful. Often you can't be sure what's going on. You can have your suspicions, and quite often we will shove a frame of eggs in, a test frame, if you don't know what's going on in our hive regarding the queen. Sometimes they seem like they're queen ripe, but you cannot find her anywhere. Sometimes they seem like they're queenless, but you can't be certain. But if you put test frame in, you'll know for certain, because when you visit next time, they'll either have reared queen cells or they won't. If they have, they're definitely queenless, I'd say. And if they haven't, the must be a queen in there, and she probably will have started laying by that time anyway.
Okay, brilliant. Roger.
Again, yeah. I think I've misheard the question. Can you read out the first line again, please?
Could the panel say something about the best way? Oh, sorry. No. When requeening a hive, how long should you wait?
That's what I thought you said.
Before you decide it's not working.
Requeening. So somebody is requeened, and then they've got a failure. That tends to suggest that perhaps the new queen hasn't taken for whatever reason. I'm wondering if Joe's misinterpreted it, because I thought I did it to start with. Anyway, right. If you have a queen that that isn't taken, we very often find there's already a queen there. There's a second one. Now, a little trick you can do, well, two tricks. One is, if you take a queen away from a colony, don't requeen it for 4 days, because that's over the time it takes of the egg to hatch into a larva. If you've still got eggs after 4 days, there's a second queen there. It's surprising during the summer how often there's a second queen there. A little trick you can try, and you won't find this in books. Well, you might find it in one book, but you won't find it in most books. Take 2 queen cells, 2 queen cages that are identical. So either clean or dirty, doesn't really matter. Go to another colony that's queen right. Take 4 or 5 queens out of a colony and put in one queen cage, and the same
4 or 5 queens.
Workers rather. 4 or 5 workers into a cage, and in the other cage, exactly the same number of workers plus the queen. Then lay those on the top of the colony that you think might be queenless, but about 3 or 4 inches apart, something like that, and then watch what happens. If they're queen right, the chances are the bees will only show scant interest in both queen cages. But if they're queenless, they'll probably climb all over the one with the queen in. Now, the reason I say the other one not to have a queen in, just workers, is you've got a sort of control there.
Yeah.
Because if they climb over both of them, then there's something else going wrong. But it is a little trick that I've done on many occasions, and it works. But it's not one that you'll pass an exam by.
Okay.
Yeah, we do that sometimes. We put a queen in a cage on top of the frames, and if they get really excited, it usually indicates they're desperate for a queen. But I don't like anything in beekeeping. I don't think it's 100%, but it does give you a very good indication.
I wonder if perhaps Norman's knows of any similar experiments that Rotham's did.
Yes, I think Colin Butler would almost certainly have done things like that in the years when he was developing queen substance and so on. So, yeah, I think they did lots of bioassays of that kind.
Okay, well, just to tag on the end of that question, a lady called Pam's just flying in with a sneaky little question. If I can just try to summarize it, have you got a tip that you use or could give to find a queen? So I struggle to find queens. Okay, I can maybe half the time go through my frames and find them first time round, but
It's
the other half,
it's a lot easier when there aren't too many bees in the colony. So early in the season is a good time to find and mark your queen, rather than when the colony is huge, and then it's a much bigger job.
Okay, thank you.
Some queens are much easier to find than others, just the way they are. Some like to hide, and some just carry on as normal, so they're easy. But I would recommend trying April, May, and then getting the queen marked, and then she's much easier to find.
But I would say a key thing also is not to stir up the colony too much before you start, because if you sort of think of the laws of probability, most likely the queen is in the center of the brood nest much of the time. But what a lot of beekeepers do is they blast smoke right into the center of the brood nest, which means he's going to go left or right or up or down. So don't do that. If you've got the entrance wide open, put a bit of smoke in one side and a bit of smoke in the other side, and that will encourage her to stay in the middle. And then hopefully when you get to that frame, if you're going through systematically, you'll find her. But you know, if you've got her on the run to start with, it makes life very difficult.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
Talking about running, bees, queens tend to copy the workers. So if the colony's calm, the queen's usually calm, and she's not going to be too far away from where you expect her to. If the colony are runners that you very often get, then they're zooming around all over the place. So is the queen. But one thing a lot of people don't do is they don't realise that fertile queens don't like being in the light. So so they like to go to the dark. So when you're taking the frame out of a colony, just look on the side that you can see, just to see if the queen's there. And when you take a frame out of a colony, look on what I call the dark side first, and there's a much better chance of seeing her there.
So
if you sort of can't find her first time round, if you can take out any frames that you're absolutely certain she's not on, maybe ones that haven't even got any bees on, and then leave the frames in pairs close together with a space between them. If it's a nice sunny day, chances are she will go for one of the dark sides between them, and then you can hopefully very carefully have a look, and hopefully she'll be there.
Yeah, going on from that, if you leave them about a quarter of an hour, the bees will tell you where she is.
All right, okay. That's a profound statement, isn't it?
Well, they will, but you do need an extra brew box, as Norman said.
Right, okay. So shaking them all through a queen excluder, these options there. Okay.
I mean, if you go through systematically and you don't find her, you know, it may be worth going through a second time and looking, but after that, you've probably stirred them up so much that you're not going to find her. But if you close everything up and go back the next day, you might find her straight away. But, you know, if you go on and on and on, your chances of finding her get less and less.
Yeah. The faster I try to find the Queen, the less likely I am to find her. And when I'm not looking for the Queen, I can often spot her. Yeah. But it's, that's just life. Okay, Grace, you look nice and warm there, or cold. If I could pick on you now, please, with a question. We have a wild population that, despite reversion to a more native genotype through heavy natural selection, suffers from introgression. You have to help people understand what that means, from non-native subspecies. Are there any protections, legal or otherwise, that people can have in place to protect free living populations?
The short answer is no. So it's something that I guess we're working towards. But if you look up the B4 project, and Joe was involved in that, I mean, they've done some great work locally, getting local protection, and from councils. And say, for example, what we will try and do here in Ireland is get our National Parks and Wildlife Service, or Cuilche, to bring in their own kind of regulations to stop people bringing in non-native bees into our natural parks and our forests. But the B4 project are well ahead in that. Maybe Joe could speak to that, because they have some even written some legal agreements between local councils to basically only allow native bees in places in Cornwall. But legally, from a government point of view, of course, the bee has the only animal really that have this dual description as a wild and a domesticated. Now, there's no way a bee is domesticated, but because it's classified as domesticated, it falls under trade laws, EU trade laws. And so governments cannot bring in protection. They cannot ban imports. That's the way it is at the moment, unless in Ireland we're pushing, but actually unless we can prove that our native bee is unique in some way. Other countries have done that, other places. So that's if you find a unique strain, or you find that the bees don't have something, and you can make it from a disease perspective. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done on that. And, you know, Norman has made the point a number of times, that's right, that if there's a ban, the importations will just go underground. And I think what we're trying to do here in Ireland instead is push to have very responsible beekeeping and to better communication. So we're building a new network in Ireland now where we will have better communication, so that if you're in a local association, that you find out what bees are locally and you don't bring something else in, and that so people who are importing bees would do it very responsibly. So the short answer is no, but there is a long answer as well. You know.
Yeah, B4 have set up what they call a reserve near me, but there's no legal protection whatsoever. No. And the protection relies on really publicity, and everybody in the area knowing it's an area dedicated to the native bee. And it works to some extent, to quite a large extent really, but there's always the odd person who will bring some other bees in, but most of the beekeepers in the area are pretty good and realise that. But the only place there's legal protection, well, Colonsay, of course, Andrew Abrahams has got legal protection for that island.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's a native population and it's Varroa free.
Yeah.
I don't know, the Isle of Man can't import bees because of Varroa. I'm not sure about Orkney, but that might be a similar situation.
There's no protection, Orkney.
No protection. So really, to be honest, it's just Andrew.
Yeah.
I think I saw Andrew Abrahams. He's actually lurking here in the audience tonight.
All right.
Andrew struggled for years and years with the authorities being really unhelpful, but eventually discovered a provision in the Wildlife and Countryside Act, which I understand was originally intended to conserve native red deer populations, and found that it could be adapted to bees, and persuaded them to come up with the Colonsay and Oronsay order, which means that only dark European honeybees can be kept on Colonsay and Oronsay. But to what extent that would be applicable elsewhere is a moot point. But it shows it can possibly be done. But in general, there's sadly no protection.
Yeah.
Carl, yeah, Roger. I think I misinterpreted the question. Because I think the question mentioned protect or protection. Now that worries me. I'm not very well up on the laws, and I may well be talking out of turn here, but I'm wondering if perhaps honeybees are given wildlife protection, if perhaps beekeepers might not then be able to handle their own colonies.
Yeah, I mean, the question of whether various bee species should be legally protected in this country has come up many times. And, you know, as with bats being protected species, unless you're a, authorized handler, you can't handle them. And so the danger has always been, if bees were protected, you wouldn't be able to collect a bumblebee nest or anything like that. So that is one of the reasons that's been given for not making them protected species. But there are, other legal mechanisms that could potentially be used, but haven't been.
You have to be careful what you wish for, really. You have to, you have to really think it through, what it will be the impact. So yeah, it's going to, we're trying to, I have committed to doing a management plan for AMM in Ireland that will, for the Department of Agriculture, it'll start off that discussion, and it'll be a live document, and we'll do it bit by bit, and trying to really educate beekeepers. A lot of beekeepers in Ireland don't know what they have. They haven't been taught about the native bee. So I think the work of like BIBBA and NIBS, and providing and people providing webinars and talks to beekeepers about what we have and what's important and what is the impact, how long the native bees have been here in comparison to imported bees, and what is at risk if you bring in these imported bees, and that it kind of disrupts the genetic integrity and the thousands of years of adaptation of native bees. And so I think when people realize that, some of them are more careful with what they do and how they do it. And it's worked quite well in a few places in Ireland. Down in Kerry, there was a very small study, it's not being published yet, where they've shown that AMM is existing in a very pure form despite the presence of buckfast nearby, because the buckfast beekeepers are doing it responsibly. They're not selling buckfast into the AMM area. They're taking note of the geographical features of the area, and so they seem to be coexisting fairly amicably at the moment. So if we could perpetuate that in other places, that would be a good start.
But Grace, we're dealing with different governments with presumably different rules. I mean, we've got Ireland, we've got Scotland, we've got England and Wales, the Isle of Man. I'm not sure about the Channel Islands, but we've got sort of 4 or 5. Is there likely to be any working together with those authorities?
Well, with Brexit now, that throws everything up in the air, doesn't it?
Brexit, what's that?
So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, to be honest, I've been kind of, I suppose SICM is one vehicle that we thought might be good, because the Irish government doesn't listen to Irish people. So pressure coming down on other European groups and things like that might make more of an impression. So I think it's going to be a long, slow slog, and I don't know what Brexit is going to do. Really, because there's bees coming down, of course, in the border as well from the north. So I think working together and positive communication has to start, and continue while the legal battles go on. So I don't know.
On the subject of Brexit, nobody knows what's going to happen. But one thing that does seem certain at the moment is that from the 1st of January, there won't be any imports of package bees into the UK, because EU countries from whence they come will become a third country, and we
Right.
don't allow package bees in from third countries. So unless there is some kind of agreement that allows
That'd
them,
be good.
there won't be any package bees. And I saw in the latest Bee Farmer that there are various people advertising package bees for 2021. Well, sadly, I think they'll be disappointed. So.
Well, that's good then.
Well, it's a mixed bag, isn't it? For some people it's good, some people it's bad. But
Yeah, I suppose.
yeah,
Well, maybe Ireland should leave the EU as well.
I'll try to tread a neutral path. But I mean, whatever situation we got on the 1st of January may be different by the end of March when the beekeeping season starts. Maybe something's in place by then, but yeah, we'll wait and see. Okay. Roger, you've not said much this evening, so if I could have a question. You talk about propagation of local bees and to sort of find the good characteristics and get more of them with your colonies. And what would you do then if you were collecting swarms where you don't know the sort of provenance or the genetics or the sort of mannerisms of the bees? And would you how would you go about assessing the queen?
Well, firstly, I will collect all swarms, because if you don't collect them, they're going to fill up somebody else's chimney and create a nuisance. So I would always collect them. I think I'm a reasonably experienced beekeeper, and you can tell straight away if they're really sick or not. If they are, then I probably wouldn't take them any further. I would probably put them in a bag and put them in the freezer. That's what I do. I know as beekeepers we shouldn't tell the general public, because they'll start jumping up and down that the bees are endangered and there's beekeepers killing them. But quite honestly, some of them are just so sick they could have absconded from a collapsing colony. I think swarms have changed quite a bit over the years. If you've got a swarm more than 25 years ago, let's say, if it was a prime swarm, it was usually quite good. It would have a good queen in it. You could chuck it in a box, and you could, if it's early in the season, put a couple of supers on it, and it would normally be okay. Okay, you might have to requeen it. But these days, things are very much different. There's a lot of small swarms, but at the same time, there are some quite good ones. If they've come from what I would call a wild nest, unmanaged nest, free living nest, call it what you like, usually they're quite good, and I would normally hang on to them. Because I don't particularly like yellow bees, if it's a yellow queen, I'll immediately requeen it, but I'll probably give her a bit of a chance, see what she does. But these days with swarms, very often the queens either turn drone layers, or they become superseded very quickly, or they simply don't start laying again. So you haven't then got much of a chance. But I would these days always give a swarm a chance. You never know; it may come from a managed colony, it may come from a wild colony, but I would always give it a crack. I know people don't like swarms, but I cannot see anything too wrong with them.
Yeah, if you've got more than one apiary, it's like I have, and I can select. I put all of the nice bees in one area, because that's where I mate all my queens, the ones with the characteristics I like. So that, and if I pick up a swarm that perhaps hasn't got those characteristics, I'll put that into another area where I don't make my queens. So I'm always keeping an area good, and I think that's a good practice. So if you want to try and improve your bees, you can make your queens where you know all the bees are pretty good.
And I assume your apiaries are more than 3 miles apart, are they?
Yeah. Well, not all of them. So, no, they're about 2 miles apart, but they extend quite a way.
Yeah, the one where you do your breeding isn't.
That's right.
Okay.
I can make them right out of the area.
Okay. I'll ask Norman a question now, because Peter's just answered one. Sorry, Joe's just answered one. This is a long one actually. Last year, I created about 10 queen cells for my best colony, and 7 made it to mates and start to raise a colony, but 3 didn't finish the summer, and they either superseded or I had to replace them elsewhere in my hives. Is that a good average, or should I focus on something else, such as drone raising, to improve my outcomes this year? So no pressure there then.
Oh, raising more drones won't necessarily alter the number of successful queen cells you get out, but it is a worthwhile thing to do to improve the quality of your strain. But I mean, unfortunately, in this country, the results you get are very much dependent on the weather, and you can do absolutely everything you can perfectly well and get a really good success rate, or you can get nothing at all, and it's not your fault, it's the weather. So you know, you just have to persevere from year to year, and you know, the number of successful mated queens you get out of it will vary from year to year, but with experience and practice, the number you get will increase, I think. So yes, persevere, but you know, also produce lots of good drones as well.
I think that's probably a fair average, to be honest.
Nature might be the best free breeder. Yeah. So yeah, sometimes you make it, sometimes you don't. Thank you.
Well, yeah, can I just leap in? Obviously, yeah. you know that I've been talking for 20 years or so about queen failures. This, I think, is typical of it. And certainly this year in the south of England, the weather just wasn't an issue at all. And I've still had young queens being superseded. I was interested that about 3 years ago at Gormanston, the summer school in Ireland, I spoke to a man who bought 10 buckfast queens, and he requeened all his colonies in early May, and Gormanston then was at the end of July, and he'd already had 8 out of those 10 turned drone layers. So it's not just local bees, queens that are a problem. It's actually those probably coming in from abroad as well. And it is actually a lot more of a problem than it used to be. So I would say if you're getting 7 out of 10, you're actually not doing too bad.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I agree with that. I think if we go 7 out of 10, you're doing bloody well, because I've had nukes this year supersede within weeks. First bit of sealed brood, and the next thing is a supersede yourself. I've had a couple disappear, and I think if we got 7 out of 10, you're doing all right. Just keep on doing what you're doing, because that's a good average in this day and age.
Oh, sorry, Carl, I just thought of something. If those queens have been mated in mini nukes, very often, if you put those into full colonies, up go the supersedure cells very quickly. And what you've got to do in that case is to knock out those supersedure cells, and then they settle down. And my guess is, but I don't know, that the queens aren't fully up to speed. The bees seem to realise it, so they replace her. Sorry, I just forgot about that. Or just remembered it, whichever way you want to look at it.
I didn't even know it. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Joe, one for you now, if you don't mind. What method of queen raising or breeding would? Sorry, let's get it right. Yeah, I'll ask Joe, but we'll actually put it to everybody. But Joe first. What method of queen raising or breeding do you recommend, and why? So, just personal preference, really.
Everybody might want to achieve something slightly different. What I do, because I want to rear quite a few queens, and we use a lot ourselves, and we also sell queens. So we're aiming for a quite large scale. So my method may not be appropriate for everybody, but it does involve grafting, which sounds complicated, but when you've been shown how to do it, you can master it very quickly, I think. And the system I use is one recommended by the MBU. Actually, I think it's known as the queen right system of queen rearing. And simply, I build the colony up onto 2 brood boxes, so the queen has access to 2 brood boxes, fills the brood frames up, and gets the colony up to strength, which is 2 brood boxes full plus, if you like. You can always put a super on, but they need to be quite strong, ideally. And then when you come to insert the grafts, you rearrange the colony with the queen in the bottom box, and put the queen excluder back in between the boxes, and you arrange the combs so there's young brood and pollen and so on. And then you drop this frame of grafts, and we did 20 at a go, drop that in, and a lot of people think, well, that's not going to work because it doesn't make sense. It's too near, it's near the queen. The queen just can't get to it. She's only below a queen excluder, but it works as well as anything. And I like it because the colony is happy because they're queen right.
Yeah.
There's food coming in and they're sharing food all around the colony, so they're well fed, and generally we get good results. It does vary, it goes up and down a bit, but commonly we can get 18. I say I tend not to do it because I'm not very good at it. I taught
can we quote you on that, Joe?
I taught my apprentice to do it, as she's not apprentice anymore, and she is so much quicker that she does it all now, and gets very good results. And that's all system we use.
Brilliant, thank you, Joe. Anybody else? How do you raise your queens?
Well, I suppose over the years I've mostly used grafting, and I have used various sort of techniques. At Rothamsted, my predecessor Peter Tompkins favoured the Genta frame system, which is an excellent method if you don't like the idea of handling young larvae. It's sort of, hands off, but I gave it up because of the way we were doing things, where we had bees in various apiaries. Unless you bring your breeder queen back to the home apiary, you're constantly driving backwards and forwards because you have to sort of put the comb in and take it out again and put the queen in and so on. So it's very suitable if you've got your bees outside your back door and it doesn't take you long to get to them. It's a good system. It's not for somebody that only wants to rear 2 or 3 queens, and there are a selection of methods, but the method you choose really has to fit what your system is. So clearly Joe's producing lots of queens and has an appropriate method.
Peter, do you have a favourite method?
Yes, I've sort of adapted what my father had in his booklet in 1984 a little bit to stick to the principles. But for a long time I used a cloak board. But this year I've spoken to a certain guy who's got yellow braces and he's not supposed to pack. and I've used a Morris board, which is graft 10 at a time, and you can do that 10 every week. And that's sort of, with the weather we got here, 20 is too many, because if the weather's a disaster, you've lost all 20. We'll do 10 a week, and you've got a chance of catching a good week for mating somewhere along the line. So the Morris board, it's not something I've used quite successfully this year, to be honest, and I think I'll stick with it again next year.
Can you just describe it, Peter, the Morris board?
Oh, you'll have to ask the man with the yellow braces. He can tell you all about it. It's a little board you got to make up. It's like a cloak board, same principle as a cloak board, but you'd only do it half size. The brood you stick all the bees in half a brood chamber above your main queen right one below. Okay. So it's on the web. It's on the Cushman website.
Okay,
not the best version of it though, Peter. Well, I think it depends very much, as Norman said, on what your needs are. Certainly for the ordinary beekeeper with less than 5 colonies, they can work on natural cells, no problem at all. If they haven't got queen swarm cells, then simply take a queen away from your the colony you want to raise queens from, and let them raise queen cells. I know it's frowned upon by some, but I'll tell you what, it's enough work if you get it right. All the other methods, because I do quite a bit of teaching, I use all of them, and they all work. And it's really down to the individual what they like. But my own real preference is the punch cell method. Unfortunately, you can't really get the punches anymore, but we're hoping to do something about that. But it really works well because you're not handling the larva. And well, in fact, you've been with me, Carl, when we've done courses,
yeah.
And 80% of people struggle to graft. I really do. And with punch cell, it doesn't matter because you just punch out the cell with exactly the same larva in. So I like that one.
I think 80% of people struggle to start grafting, but almost all of them were picking it up towards the end. Whereas with the punching, they just got it right first time. Put the tube over the cell, and it was dead easy. It was almost difficult to get it wrong. With the grafting, you can knock the larvae a few times and rub them up the edge of the cell and so on. Okay.
Can I get back?
Sorry. Like for me, like I have, you know, I don't have huge experience of breeding bees, and I don't have lots and lots and lots of colonies. So I have about 15 colonies, but and I know people frown it, but I actually like making splits. I like making nooks and making splits, and I find they work really, really well. I get at least 3/4 of any nooks, any splits that I do taking, and I also requeen. Sometimes I'll split a hive into 3. And one of the nooks will have the queen and the other 2 won't. And there'll be a set left in the hive and they'll rear queens. And so I like to perpetuate my good colonies that way. And then I can give the nooks also away to people who need nooks. So for people who have few colonies, whatever, I find it's early enough, especially in Ireland with the weather. Sometimes I go grafting and the weather's crap, and you know, so it's easy. As long as you do right. Yeah.
There's a good question that follows on from that feedback. Thank you. For those people that don't have native bees, would it be a feasible strategy, Grace, to introduce a few native queens into the apiary, or to start splitting your most native ones each year in order to increase the sort of native type genetic content gradually? Yeah.
Well, I suppose, you know, different strokes for different folks, and in England it's quite different in some ways to Ireland. In Ireland we have, I would say, 85–90% of people probably have dark bees, and most of them have good purity. The UK is different. So, and then we have a recent discussion about local bees and the importance of local bees, because it's all about adaptation to the environment. And so, like, if you have people around you that I have, for example, when I see banded bees, I'm killing the queen and I'm putting a frame of eggs from a black colony in there. And I've been given frames of eggs of my black colonies to people to do the same thing. I guess if you bring in a black bee from too far away, that bee has to acclimatize to your local area. And so, you know, it can be successful sometimes and it can be unsuccessful. So even in Ireland, people have transported bees, you know, from the west to the Midlands, or from Dublin to the Midlands, and vice versa, and they haven't taken. And sometimes they do take. So as Norman said before, it really depends on some of its luck and the weather. But I would be thinking about finding out what's in your local area with your local association, and going for finding black bees in your local area as much as possible, and then trying to make, And then I'm looking now at the moment, actually looking at the impact of selection for color on the color trait, and how real that color trait is now. And I'm hoping that will be able to provide to beekeepers. I'm going back to you comparing morphometrics to genotyping, and looking at the impact of these traits on a range of bees. So I have still some UK bees, so bees that are brown and bees that are black and bees that are small abdomens, bees that have big abdomens, and really trying to work out what is native and what's a mix, and maybe provide that as a guide to beekeepers, post all the pictures, the photographs, and the wing venation and everything. so people can look. But yeah, so I'm kind of coming around to native bees. Sometimes, like even in Ireland now, there have been people who have been breeding Buckfast here for, you know, 100 years now. Buckfast is in Ireland. And the Buckfast in Ireland is not like the original Buckfast. It's not a Ligustica mellifera cross with other things. It's a Carnica AM cross. So Buckfast in Ireland is not Buckfast, and we have to characterize what it is. But some of those bees have been in Ireland for 100 years. And my feeling is that at the moment, very few to none of the wild free living bees that I sample have a non-M maternal lineage. So I don't think the imported bees are surviving very well in Ireland in comparison to native bees. So I'm just saying, you might be surprised around you that you'll get black bees, and that the bees that have been here for a long time have some adaptation. How long is necessary for adaptation? That's a good discussion for another time. So I've gone around the houses there, but I would be cautious. Summary: local, if you can get reasonably black local. And, you know, by all means, if you want to bring in good black bees, if you get them from somewhere that's trustworthy, I would say try it. But if they don't work, it's probably because there's a big difference and they have to acclimatize. So maybe be very nice to your bees, your black bees, if you bring them in from somewhere else. Take good care of them, because they might struggle to adapt for a little while. Norman,
yeah, I was just going to say it really depends on where you are and what you're starting with. So, you know, as for the UK, I mean, I would say in Wales and Scotland, you're probably not so far away from the situation in Ireland, and also in the southwest, extreme southwest where Joe is. You know, clearly there's a lot of black bee in there. In the southeast of England, things are clearly a lot more mixed up. But even then, I think there are, you know, the samples that were collected from Sussex and so on proved there was a lot more black bee in them than certainly we expected. So I would tend to always try and make the best of what you've got already. And certainly at the start of our breeding at Sussex University, we tried to bring in black bees. Well, we had some from Scotland, we had some from Andrew, we had some from Michael McGillicudder, we had some from Northern Ireland, we had some from Cornwall, and I'm sure they were all marvellous bees where they came from, but none of them were any good in Sussex, and they mostly went down with chalk brood and fizzled out after a very short time. So, you know, that was a real lesson to us.
Because you might, following on from that, you might, if you're going to think about bees, not think about bringing in, you might think about your environment, and actually it might be better to bring in bees from further away, but from a similar environment, than close by, but in a very different microclimate. So bees have been exchanged between Colonsay and Micheál McGillicudder is quite a bit. You know, you might be able to exchange bees from Wales and the west of Ireland quite a bit, or east of Ireland, but actually the Midlands versus the coast is very, very different. So if you're coastal, maybe get bees that are coastal elsewhere rather than picking bees from the Midlands. And if you're in the Midlands, pick bees from the Midlands. So think about the environment and where you're living, where your apiary is, and get bees from a similar environment, because they will have adapted to that environment rather than local, rather than distance, if that makes sense.
But I mean, that's a good point. But as well as that, there of course are local strains of diseases that they won't have come up with, and I think that's the explanation for the chalk brood problems we had, that those bees have simply not been exposed to the particular strains of chalk brood that we obviously have in the southeast of England. So you know, these are all points to be borne in mind, I think.
Yeah.
I'll just say something from the National Bee Improvement Programme point of view. We expect beekeepers to try and find local bees and improve their local bees, but it is allowed that people can bring in bees to strengthen their strain or whatever, either from nearby or anywhere in the British Isles, actually, Britain and Ireland. So it will be up to the individual locals or local groups to make up their mind of what policy they have, but it will be allowable, and it may be useful to strengthen the strain or whatever.
I think the issue, Joe, is one of culture, really. A lot of people are have now just got it in their head, said, oh, they want a queen, so go and buy it. So if it comes from Greece or Italy, that's okay. And they seem to think that perhaps we're asking them to buy a queen from somewhere else. So let's say Cornwall, a queen from Northumberland will be okay. Well, it probably won't.
Yeah, locally adapted can be more local than you think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we've got to get the message across that no, we're not expecting you to buy a queen from a different place. We're hopefully expecting you to raise queens from what you've already got.
What I'm trying to encourage here as well is the local associations should really be making a big effort to rear nooks for beginners, and that they have locally reared nooks that they can supply to beginners, and that you have a community network so that if somebody loses bees, that they have a source, a supply. So really, you know, people, you know, and I know my local association here actually didn't work very well this year. They had a relative beginner looking after it. And the beginner, of course, COVID is a problem as well, but you know, training people, it's a perfect opportunity to train beginners to rear queens, and to extend an apiary. And then if those overwintered nooks then are available for next year's beginners, you train people, and then you have a whole supply ready for the next year. So that's what I'm trying to push local associations to do, that because they don't really do a lot of bee improvement here, or bee rearing for beginners. And then beginners don't know when they start having bees, they don't know the difference between the bees, and then somebody sells them a fabulous native buckfast, which doesn't exist. It's not a real thing. But beginners don't know that, and they shouldn't be expected to know that unless we tell, you know, they're told. So it would be great if we could get more local breeding of local bees. But it's tough because it's hard to rear bees in England and Ireland, you know.
Roger, will you recall someone said that they had, you asked if someone had handled native bees, and someone said they had.
Yeah.
They were buckfast bees that come from Devon.
Yeah, and they come from Devon, yeah. Actually, I was just thinking, the 5 people, well, in fact, 6 people we got here. You got Norman and myself, who live probably, what, 4 or 5 miles away, something like that. Joe's probably 160 miles from me. Peter, similar sort of amount. As a crow flies, I wouldn't mind betting that Grace is no more than about 300 miles away from me, and you, I think, are 127. Now, that is actually geographically quite a close distance. But my guess is that we need very different types of bees. I know Peter's almost marginal where he is. I guess out in Galway, you're similar too, aren't you, Grace?
Marginal, what do you mean?
Well, you struggle to keep bees because of lack of forage and.
Well, the forage is good. Well, my bees are great. Like, they take care of themselves. I don't do any supplementary feeding or anything like that. So our bees, this summer was a bit tough. There was a bit of a big break. This summer we had to feed some of the bees. There was a good bit of starvation. But normally I don't feed my bees at all.
Well, Connemara beekeepers are all saying that they struggle, and they're not far from you, are they?
Yeah. I mean, I was going to put an apiary out in Connemara, and I thought, no, it'll be way too much work. I'd have to be going out all the time. So where we are around here, there's loads of forage.
Oh, right, okay.
But it depends where you are. But the weather's a nuisance. I'm going to have to build a mobile marquee next summer to go around and do some of the work we want to do, because you can't have, sometimes you don't have 2 days in a row where it's dry. This summer was bad. The very time you want to be queen rearing and doing like pinprick tests and all that for varroa tolerance or resistance, all these things, the one time you might have time to do it, the rain was just, July is just a nightmare here.
July was a nightmare in Wales as well. It's the one time of year I want a nice settled fortnight, and we didn't get it.
Yeah.
And it's quite often we don't get it. I mean, we had it 2019, we had it 2018, but it's because sometimes you can go for 5 or 6 years, and you know, and that's when your buckfast bees fall over, you know.
Yeah.
If you had it 2 years in a row, I mean, you're getting spoiled now,
Right.
Peter.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. There's a comment from Hans saying, "Great. Associations should indeed provide newts and queens." And Joe, you mentioned about NAPVIP and local queens. What would happen if you were sort of to find out, and Nigel asked a question. He's recently been informed that 2 buckfast queens have been introduced into the training apiary of my local association. I'm a BIBBA member. What should my reaction be?
Go down there and punch them.
It's really difficult, yeah. I mean, for years, I suppose I had the same trouble in our local apiary, our association apiary. It's all buckfast. I mean, luckily I'm far enough away not for it to affect me, but you can't do anything positive in the group like that. But what we did actually was got together with the members of the association who did think alike, and we formed our own group for bee improvement, and it works well. You can do that, and you've got to ignore what else is going on. But I think what we're hoping that this will happen less and less. I mean, it's a bit optimistic, but because of this NatBit program, we're trying to promote it all over the country and get people more aware of what is happening with our bees, really. And hopefully it will reduce this tendency to bring in buckfast or whatever, and just improve what we've got. And if more and more people get the message, which I think they are slowly, things like that will happen less frequently.
Probably my phrasing isn't good. I've nothing against buckfast because they're lovely. It's just you can't breed them true, so you end up with something different next time round, and you're into a cycle of buying queens from wherever you got the last lot. But sorry, Norman, yeah, you'll probably know the answer.
I was just going to say, following on from Grace's comment that the buckfast bees in Ireland don't appear to be particularly closely related to the buckfast bees from buckfast that Brother Adam reared, I think that's a general comment, and that buckfast bees from all around the world, from Germany, from Denmark, and so on, are very different from each other, and very different from the ones in Ireland, and very different from Brother Adam's. And I'm sure if you go to those breeders, they will be able to show you their pedigrees showing that they were descended from bees that originally came from Buckfast Abbey. But all the while, you can't keep a strain the same forever. All the while you are rearing queens, you are in some way selecting them, and they're all selecting for different things under different conditions and ending up with very different bees. And I've got a slide I made where I just looked on the internet for pictures of buckfast bees from various places, and they're all very different. Some are really yellow, some are really brown, some are stripy, some are black, and they're very different things. I would love somebody to do a molecular study to look at buckfast bees from different places and see what they really are and how they're related to each other. And I think that would be fascinating. But
the
I mean, really,
is, though, that in Ireland, like I've been trying to get buckfast, and also Carnica, we're getting, obviously we have a good bit of Carnica coming into Ireland. There's a good few Eastern Europeans in Ireland, and they're bringing them in their pockets, and I think that's having a huge impact now in Ireland. But some of them, because of this, in Ireland, there's quite a bit of aggression between native and importers. So a lot of people, they won't give me bees. I mean, I'm a member of the Buckfast and Carnolian Facebook page, but some people are very kind to me, but some people they just don't want to know. And so to try and get the bees from these people, they don't want us to show what they are, because they might not be what they think they are either, and they just don't want to do it anyway. So I think you're right, it'd be an amazing, but I think we need more of a bigger study in Europe on honeybees, because there's very little. I was amazed when I started bee research in 2013-14, that given the importance of the honeybee, how little population genomics evolutionary studies have been done on the honeybee. In 2014, the IUCN Red List is data deficient because I think you were on the review group, Norman. There was no evidence that wild bees existed anywhere. People didn't know about honeybees, and there's still talk about, in the Colossus, about whether subspecies are real. Yes, they're bloody real, but some people in Europe don't think the races and subspecies are real entities. But there's such little data. I mean, we've generated a lot of data, and when I went to compare it to everything else known, there was very little known. There's probably,
I
so
think there's
really
a lot of interesting stuff to come out of the Smart Bees project, which hasn't been published yet.
Yeah.
But that was a very large data set, so I'd be very interested to see what comes out of that. And
Absolutely.
also the Year Best project that I'm sort of vaguely involved in comes to an end next April, and they've been working on, you know, a range of populations on a commercial scale in various places, and they include some buckfast breeders. So again, there should be some interesting results from that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Carl,
Yeah.
Getting back to the question, personally, I don't think BIBBA or anybody else, NatBIBBA or anybody else should be diving in and telling any local association what to do. I think that will end up in a few bullet holes and a few feet. But I think to answer the question, I think the way I would handle it was very quietly speak to the person who authorised the buckfast coming in and ask if they'd actually listened to this series of webinars. If they haven't, then suggest that they look at the recordings, and then just ask a few questions. You know, do they know of the reported second generation aggression? All sorts of things like that, because that can actually have an effect. Because if all of a sudden the next generation goes ballistic, it won't be the buckfast that get blamed, it'll be the local bees. That's what I think will happen. Yeah. So I think it ought to be treated with caution. Persuasion is a much better tool than force.
Okay. We've got 28 questions rattling in, and I've still got a few left to go, but I think we're timing out. Can I just ask one question, please, to each of you, really? From by Nicholas. Why are black bees deemed preferable? Yeah.
I think it all depends on where you are, and I think in many parts of certainly Ireland and the UK as well, the native bees were dark bees, and therefore they're probably the best starting point. If you were asking the question in southern Italy, the answer would be completely different. It's, you know, we live in a place where black bees were there, and in fact still are much more than people imagine, and therefore they should be the starting point for, you know, looking for a good bee for you.
I also like to make the point that with bees, we have two issues here. One is conservation and one is beekeeping. And as beekeepers, they often like to think themselves as custodians of honeybees. And in a way, yes, you are, but then that comes with some responsibility. So I think that native bees have been here for 6,500 years, and they have adapted to the environment really tightly for 6,500 years. And they have all of these traits that, as Norman said, allow them to be better bees, or, you know, fitter bees in the local environment. So one thing is, if you bring in non-native bees, you disrupt these co-adapted gene complexes and you can really do damage to a native subspecies. That's one thing. So from a conservation perspective, we should be, and beekeepers should be, protecting the subspecies that is native, because actually that subspecies is threatened with extinction throughout its distribution range, and it's the bee that has become adapted to the Northern Hemisphere. And from a biodiversity perspective, we have a responsibility to protect biodiversity. If we end up with all mongrels, that, as Carol said, the next generation, you don't know what you have, it actually makes breeding very difficult. So from a perspective, some people love their buckfast. They have some lovely traits that maybe the native bee doesn't. But you have to then be careful of the damage, or of the impact on the native bees. So from a conservation perspective, we should be minding our native bees, even if as a beekeeper you choose to have something different. So I think we have that responsibility. Yeah, and so I think some of the traits that have been, the native bees have been maligned because they're aggressive and they're not good honey producers and they're not this and they're not that. All of that may have been in a place where where there has been hybridization. So the aggression, for example, is now thought to be second generation with Carnolian bees, because they're also dark and people can't tell the difference. You've got these dark bees that are aggressive, but you don't know that they're not necessarily native bees. And then we have native bees producing as much honey as buckfast bees, depending on the year, depending on the situation. So I think there's two things here, conservation and beekeeping, that you need to bear in mind. Yeah.
With the word responsibility in there, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, any other view?
I think the last two answers show that it's a good thing to have scientists on board. So you know, it just broadens the spread. From my point of view, having removed well, several hundred colonies from the wild, you just do not get yellow queens. And okay, some of the bees are the worker bees are yellow, but you do not get yellow, or I've never seen yellow queens, and it's because they simply do not survive.
Yeah. So they have to be replaced. You have to bring in queens every year. Now in Ireland, they say the buckfast, they can breed them, but I don't think they're buckfast anymore. I think Roger's point is 100%, and I'm chasing this down. I think that if you look at the amount of introgression from native bees into buckfast, you will, what I find is that most buckfast that are so-called buckfast that are surviving in Ireland are actually predominantly AMM. In fact, some of the buckfast that were sampled in Kerry were actually total AMM. So this is what we're seeing now. I think I have also not found, all, as I said, all the mitochondrial lineages were M lineage. And so the bees are, if you're happy to import every single year, then that's fine. But if you want a chance of breeding your own bees, you're better off with native bees.
It's Norman.
Yeah, it just struck me that the word aggression has been mentioned a couple of times this evening, and I see there are a couple of people who've asked about it, and we haven't really talked about it at all. Somebody asked, you know, why if you cross one bee with another, do you get aggressive bees? And there are various reasons, but a lot of it is to do with hybrid vigor. And, you know, if you take two lines that are very different from each other and put them together, you tend to get an effect in a certain trait which is greater than that either of the parents had. And, you know, that may be expressed in many ways. And with bees, that may be expressed in aggression. And the more different the bees you cross are, the more likely you are to get aggression. And so it is a, you know, generally accepted fact that honeybees evolved in Africa and then went their various ways. And one group came up through sort of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, and up through northwestern Europe. And those are the ones we had. And then there are others that sort of headed out over the Near East and then eventually ended up the sort of far side of the Alps. And that's actually where the Italian and Carniolan bees come from. And so from a relatedness point of view, the native honeybee Apis mellifera mellifera is actually more closely related to African bees than it is to Italian or Carniolan bees. And therefore, if you bring in a Carniolan bee or an Italian bee or a buckfast, which is effectively a mixture of those, and put them together with a native bee, you are going to get, in the first cross between them, hybrid vigor, which may well express itself as aggressiveness. But as Roger has said, it's always blamed on the black bee, whereas that's not the case. And somebody else was saying, you know, is that inevitable and is it a perpetual problem? No, it's not actually. Aggression can be bred out quite quickly. Yeah. And when we started our breeding work at Sussex, within a year or so, we produced some very hygienic bees that were Varroa tolerant, but were truly appalling. And we thought, oh no, you know, what have we done here? Is hygienic behavior linked to high aggression? And we were very worried, but actually it clearly isn't. And we were able to get rid of that aggression within a very short time. So, you know, it's not an inevitable consequence of what you're doing. And if you know, pursue breeding and back crossing and so on, things like aggression can be bred out very quickly.
Brilliant. Any other views on black bees?
Well, yeah, I think they are the dominant bee in this country. I think if we didn't keep importing they would be ultimately they would be the survivors, which doesn't mean they're any good. But the thing is, they're the easiest ones to work with, to make them good, to select and improve. And that's why I stick with them, because I think we can select and improve them, whereas we can't do that with hybrids or mongrels. It's probably a bit more apt now, because we haven't got any control over the mating. It's not like a farm animal where you can choose a bull and choose a cow and cross them. Bees mate at random pretty much. And we haven't got that control, so it's best to not mix the subspecies up, I think. It hasn't really done much for us, I don't think, in the last 160 years, and it's time to try a different approach.
Let's just start to draw this to a close. We've had over 2,800 attendees to the actual webinars that you 5 people have held. And there's been over 2,000 people watching the recordings. The recordings are available on the BIBBA website. Other than Grace's recording, she's part way through some work, and she was giving some early results and indications, but she's still doing that work. And when that work's finalized, I think that is the recording that we'll all be wanting to hear and see. So you guys, and certainly today with 380 odd, you've touched well over 5,000 people with what you've done. Thank you so much to Roger, Joe, Norman, Peter and Grace for this evening. And thank you to all you people signing in as well, asking questions. Unfortunately, the questions are coming 3 times as fast as we can ever answer them. But please be assured, we're trying to capture them. And it's events like this that are drawing out some of the questions that we missed, or some of the questions that it's actually worth posing to scientists and bee farmers and just ordinary people to see the breadth of the answers, because there isn't one answer, but there is an approach. And I think to try to sum it up, yeah, I guess there's a preference for black bees, but with beekeeping comes, as Grace said, the idea of keeping bees, which is fantastic, but like any animal, you know, there's responsibility, and partly conservation of the bees and not disrupting the local genetic pool is part of that. And Peter's lived with it for 50 years. When something different comes into his area, it takes a few generations to calm it down. Roger's seen it with bees that he's dug out of barns and things that, as he says, tend not to be yellow. And Joe, I think over many years has developed a strain of bee that he likes. It just happens to be darker in color and exhibiting the sort of AMM characteristics. As for Grace and Norman, please carry on with the science. Science is there to challenge the status quo, challenge any assumptions and paradigms, and to provide something that's quantifiable, verifiable, and reproducible, I believe, are the sort of words you guys use, because there's a lot of anecdotal stuff that goes on in beekeeping, and it helps all of us if you can just help provide the stepping stones for the future. So thank you one and all, including all the participants attending tonight. There will be a range of other webinars coming up. Roger, I think, is threatening to launch about another 24 or so. We'll continue on the NatBit theme through to spring, but there'll be a range of other interesting chats to keep you well occupied during the various lockdowns and dark days and whatever. They are all recorded and they are all freely available to BIBBA members, non-BIBBA members, beekeepers, non-beekeepers alike, to enjoy and have a bit of self-education. So thank you everybody and good night.
Thank you, Carl.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Good questions.
Bye.
As well. Cheers.